For decades, an archive that should never have seen the light of day remained sealed in a private vault in San Francisco. These were not government documents or military secrets, but something infinitely more disturbing to the conventional structures of reality. The final recordings of Sylvia Browne, the 20th century's most controversial psychic medium, taped just 3 months before her death in November 2013. What she revealed in these final hours of spiritual lucidity challenged not only established beliefs about death, but exposed a truth she had kept for over 5 decades of psychic work. What truly happens when children are about to cross the veil between worlds? Sylvia had spent her entire life navigating between skeptics and devotees, between those who revered her as a bridge to the divine and others who denounced her as a charlatan. But in the final months of her earthly existence, something fundamental shifted in her perception. The visions that had accompanied her since childhood became sharper, more urgent, as if the cosmos itself was preparing to reveal its deepest secrets through her expanded consciousness. It was then that she decided to record, in complete secrecy, her most intimate experiences with the phenomenon that had haunted her for decades: the spiritual visions of children in the process of transition. The archive, recently discovered by a testamentary executor, contained over 8 hours of cassette tape recordings, handwritten transcripts, and personal notes that revealed a never-before-seen side of the medium. Gone was the carefully constructed public persona, the prepared answers for television interviews. There was only a 77-year-old woman, weary of earthly battles, but deeply connected with truths that transcended any common human understanding. Her voice, though physically weakened, carried a spiritual certainty she had never publicly demonstrated with such intensity. In the recordings, Sylvia recalled with impressive detail her first encounters with dying children, experiences that shaped not only her career but her very soul. She described how, at 17, during a visit to a children's hospital in Detroit, she had witnessed something that would forever change her understanding of death and the afterlife. A 5-year-old girl hospitalized with terminal leukemia had begun to converse animatedly with people no one else could see. These were not hallucinations caused by medication, as the doctors insisted. They were real encounters with departed loved ones, grandparents she had never physically known, guardian angels patiently awaiting the moment of transition. What most impressed Sylvia was not just that the child saw these presences, but the complete transformation in her energy. Minutes earlier, apathetic and suffering, the girl radiated a peace and joy that seemed to emanate from another dimension. Her eyes shone with a light that did not belong to the physical world, and her words carried a wisdom that transcended her chronological age. She spoke of beautiful places awaiting her, of family members eager to embrace her again, of the absence of pain and suffering in the world she was going to. There was no fear, only sweet anticipation and a deep connection with something infinitely greater than earthly existence. Sylvia realized at that moment that children possessed a unique spiritual advantage in the dying process. Their souls had not yet been completely conditioned by the limitations of physical reality. They maintained a natural connection with higher planes, an unconscious remembrance of their divine origin that adults gradually lost through years of incarnation. One of the most touching accounts involved a 4-year-old girl who, in her last moments, began to describe a great gathering awaiting her. She spoke of dozens of people who would come to greet her, some she had known on Earth and others who had always been part of her spiritual family. There was no sadness in her words, only a joyous anticipation, as if she were preparing for the most wonderful party of her existence. Her last words were, "They're here. It's time for the party." Sylvia realized that these experiences were not unique to Western cultures. She had documented similar cases on different continents, suggesting that the universal nature of the soul transcended cultural, linguistic, and religious barriers. Tibetan children spoke of encounters with reincarnated lamas. African children described tribal ancestors who came to fetch them. Native American children reported visions of animal spirits that would guide them on the final journey. Regardless of the cultural context, the essence of the experience remained consistent: death as a celebrated transition, not feared. The archive also revealed Sylvia's personal struggle with institutional skepticism. She had tried on several occasions to share her discoveries with the medical community, hoping they could develop more compassionate approaches to caring for terminally ill children. But she encountered systematic resistance. Doctors who initially showed interest quickly backed away when they realized the spiritual implications of her research. Hospitals that had allowed her presence began to restrict her access, fearing controversy or legal action. This resistance led Sylvia to work more discreetly, offering spiritual guidance through informal networks of nurses and chaplains who recognized the value of her perspective. She trained other mediums to identify the signs of spiritual communication in dying children, creating an unofficial support network that operated parallel to the conventional medical system. This work, though less publicly visible, was perhaps her most significant contribution to humanity. If you are interested in exploring more of these extraordinary revelations about the nature of the soul and the mysteries of existence, consider following our content, where we continue to unravel archives and testimonies that illuminate the deepest aspects of human and spiritual experience. In her final recordings, Sylvia addressed a question that had troubled her for decades. Why did some children seem to resist the transition process while others embraced it with natural joy? Her observations suggested that the difference was related to the specific nature of each soul and its incarnational purpose. Some children came to Earth with specific missions that could be fulfilled in a short time, while others arrived with more complex lessons that required longer experiences. Children who resisted the transition often had deeper karmic ties with earthly family members or unfinished missions that their young souls could not yet fully comprehend. In these cases, Sylvia observed that the dying process became more gradual, allowing the children to emotionally process the separation while gradually opening themselves to the spiritual realities that awaited them. She recounted the case of a 7-year-old boy who, diagnosed with a terminal illness, spent months fighting the idea of leaving. Not out of fear of death, but from an intuitive feeling that his mother would not be able to cope with the loss. During his visions, he constantly saw his spiritual family trying to console him, but he also perceived the anguish of his earthly mother. Only when the mother began to spiritually accept his departure, speaking openly about his journey to heaven and assuring him that she would be fine, was the boy able to relax and allow the transition to occur naturally. Sylvia realized that these cases illustrated the profound interconnection between incarnated souls and how love transcends physical dimensions. Dying children frequently became spiritual mediators, not only for their own transitions, but for the spiritual growth of everyone around them. Their experiences with the spiritual world ended up touching doctors, nurses, family members, and even strangers, planting seeds of spiritual awakening that would blossom years later. One of the most fascinating aspects documented by Sylvia was the ability of children to serve as bridges between dimensions even after death. She reported numerous cases where children who had transitioned continued to appear to family members, especially to other children in the family. These visits were not hauntings in the traditional sense, but loving communications intended to maintain family bonds and offer comfort during the grieving process. A mother had shared with Sylvia how her 5-year-old daughter, who had died of cancer, continued to visit her twin brother. The boy, initially devastated by the loss, began to report nightly conversations with his sister, who assured him that she was happy and waiting for him in the future, but that he needed to live his earthly life completely before they reunited. These visits continued for several years, gradually diminishing as the boy matured and developed his own adult psychic defenses. Sylvia observed that these post-mortem communications were more common among children because they maintained the spiritual flexibility to perceive multiple dimensions simultaneously. Adults, conditioned by physical reality, often unconsciously blocked these perceptions, even when desperately wishing for contact with deceased children. The irony was that the more intensely adults sought these communications, the harder it became to receive them, as despair created energetic interferences that obscured natural spiritual channels. The archive also revealed Sylvia's own mystical experiences during these encounters with dying children. She described how, when present during transitions, she was often able to perceive the spiritual beings who came to fetch them. These were not ethereal or ghostly figures, but radiant presences of unconditional love that emanated a light that seemed to come from dimensions beyond normal human comprehension. On one particularly striking occasion, while accompanying a 6-year-old girl in her final moments, Sylvia reported seeing a majestic woman of maternal appearance who approached the bedside. The presence radiated a spiritual authority that transcended any earthly hierarchy, and Sylvia intuitively understood that it was a spiritual guide of the highest level, possibly what Christians call the Virgin Mary, or what other traditions know by different names. The entity did not utter audible words, but communicated directly with the child's consciousness, conveying assurances of eternal love and infinite protection. The girl, who had been semi-conscious due to medication, suddenly opened her eyes with surprising clarity. Her face lit up with a joy that seemed to come from another dimension, and she extended her arms as if being embraced by someone invisible to physical eyes. Her last words were, "She's so beautiful, Mommy. She says I'm going to live in her palace." Moments later, the child expired with a serene smile that remained on her face even after physical death. Sylvia realized that these experiences were not coincidences or projections of her own spiritual desires. They followed consistent patterns that suggested an objective reality of the spiritual world that became accessible in moments of transition. Children, by their less conditioned nature, served as natural windows to these higher dimensions, allowing sensitive observers like her to glimpse truths that normally remained veiled. The archive also documented the evolution of Sylvia's own understanding of the nature of the soul. She had concluded that children were not less developed souls, as some spiritual traditions suggested, but often highly evolved beings who chose brief incarnations to fulfill specific missions or to offer lessons of unconditional love to those who remained behind. Their deaths, though painful for earthly families, served as catalysts for the spiritual awakening of many people. She recounted the case of an atheist family who, after witnessing the spiritual visions of their dying son, began to question their materialistic beliefs. The boy, only 4 years old, had begun to speak of Jesus and angels weeks before his death, using language and concepts he had never learned in his secular education. His descriptions were so vivid and consistent that they gradually convinced his parents that he was truly experiencing genuine spiritual encounters. The impact extended beyond the immediate family. Doctors and nurses who witnessed the boy's experiences began to question their own perspectives on death and the afterlife. Some sought out Sylvia years later, sharing how that experience had planted seeds of spiritual awakening that continued to grow in their lives. The boy, through his brief incarnation and conscious transition, had touched dozens of people in ways that would reverberate for generations. Sylvia realized that these children often came with specific spiritual contracts, agreements made on the astral plane before incarnation. Their earthly families, though unaware of these agreements, had agreed to participate in these experiences as part of their own spiritual growth. The pain of loss, though real and intense, served as a catalyst for expansion of consciousness and development of compassion. In the final excerpts of the recordings, Sylvia addressed a question that had deeply troubled her: the role of religious institutions in interpreting these experiences. She had observed how different traditions reacted to the accounts of dying children and was frustrated by the tendency to force these universal experiences into specific doctrinal molds. Christian children reported visions of Jesus and angels, but also of non-Christian grandparents and even deceased pets. Children from Muslim families described encounters with Islamic figures, but also with relatives who had practiced other religions. Children from agnostic homes had visions of beings of light that transcended any specific religious category. Sylvia concluded that the spiritual world was infinitely more inclusive and loving than any human doctrine could express. She lamented how religious leaders frequently tried to appropriate these experiences to validate their own beliefs, losing the opportunity to recognize the universal truth that transcends all sectarian divisions. Children, in their spiritual innocence, were reporting the reality of unconditional divine love, but conditioned adults turned their words into theological arguments. The archive culminated with Sylvia's final reflections on the meaning of these experiences for humanity as a whole. She had concluded that dying children were spiritual gifts offered to humanity, opportunities to recall fundamental truths about the nature of existence that modern society had forgotten. Their transitions were not tragedies to be mourned, but celebrations to be honored. In her final words, recorded just weeks before her own death, Sylvia expressed deep gratitude for having been chosen to witness these sacred experiences. She had understood that her own earthly mission was completing and that she would soon personally experience the truths she had observed in so many children throughout her life. There was no fear in her voice, only a serene anticipation of a glorious reunion with all those little beings who had departed before her. The archive had remained sealed not out of shame or fear, but out of respect for the sacredness of the experiences it contained. Now, finally released, it serves as a powerful testament that death is not the end of the human journey, but merely a transition to more glorious and complete dimensions of existence. Children, in their natural spiritual wisdom, always knew this. Through the eyes of Sylvia Browne, we can finally glimpse this too.